The Zephyrian Archaeological Institute stood as a monument to intellectual hubris, its crystalline spires reaching toward the triple suns like accusatory fingers pointed at the universe's mysteries. For 3 millennia, the galaxy's most pompous, prestigious scholars had gathered here to congratulate themselves on their collective brilliance, while solving the cosmos's linguistic puzzles with all the efficiency of a bureaucratic committee trying to define the color blue. And oh, how they loved their mysteries. The Institute's halls hummed with the self-important chatter of a dozen species, each convinced their particular brand of superior evolution had granted them unique insights into the ancient ways. Resident scholars, their crystalline bodies refracting light in patterns that supposedly represented higher thought frequencies, clinked melodiously as they debated theoretical frameworks that had produced exactly 0 practical results. Nearby, the drifters' sentient gas clouds contained in environmental suits that cost more than most planets' annual budgets, whispered among themselves in electromagnetic frequencies that they claimed carried the wisdom of stellar winds. The calculans, those delightful machine hybrid entities, processed data streams with the mechanical precision of beings who had surgically removed anything resembling intuition from their consciousness. They approached every problem like an equation to be solved, which worked wonderfully for mathematics and terribly for anything requiring actual understanding of how living beings thought. For 847 standard years, not that anyone was counting except for the increasingly desperate Institute administrators, this collection of galactic intellectual elite had been collectively stumped by what they had grandly termed the Void Script. The name itself was a masterpiece of academic pretension, designed to make something sound far more mysterious than it had any right to be. The script had been discovered across 17 different star systems, carved into ruins that predated most known civilization. Each site told the same story. An advanced species had left behind extensive writings in a language that looked deceptively simple but refused to yield its secrets to any form of analysis. The galaxy's finest minds could devise. The symbols were clean, geometric, almost elegant in their simplicity. They practically begged to be understood, and yet, they remained as inscrutable as a politician's promise. The resonance had tried harmonic analysis, believing the shapes might correspond to sound frequency. Their 3-century effort had produced a symphony that sounded like dying whales, arguing about tax policy. The drifters applied their electromagnetic perception, convinced the script held quantum linguistic pattern. Their results suggested the ancient writers had been very concerned about something that translated roughly to purple elephant mathematics, which seemed unlikely. The calculans, less their systematically logical processors, had run every conceivable algorithm against the script. They had produced probability matrices, correlation charts, and statistical analyses that could have papered the Institute's walls twice over. Their conclusion, delivered with characteristic machine precision, was that the script either contained no meaningful information whatsoever, or represented a form of communication so alien that it existed outside the boundaries of logic itself. None of these explanations sat well with academics whose entire careers were built on the premise that they could understand anything, given enough time and sufficient quantities of grant funding. The Institute's director, a being whose species name was unpronounceable and whose ego was inversely proportional to their actual accomplishments, had watched their reputation slowly crumble as the centuries passed. Other institutions began to snicker. Rival scholars published papers with titles like The Zephyrian Failure, When Academic Pride Meets Immovable Object. Graduate students started choosing other research focuses, unwilling to stake their careers on what was increasingly seen as an unsolvable puzzle, which brought the Institute to its current state of dignified desperation. The director stood before the latest emergency committee meeting, their auxiliary breathing apparatus hissing with what might have been frustration or just poor maintenance. Around the polished conference table sat the usual suspects. The head of xenolinguistics, a pompous resonant, who had built their career on other people's translations. The chief archaeological analyst, a drifter, whose previous successes had involved considerably less challenging material. And the senior computational linguist, a calculan, whose programming apparently did not include modules for admitting defeat. Esteemed colleagues, the director began, their translator struggling with what sounded suspiciously like sarcasm, we find ourselves at an unprecedented junction, which was academic speak for we are screwed. The void script remained as mysterious as ever, mock them from display cases throughout the institute like a cosmic joke with a punchline nobody understood. Worse, news of their continued failure had spread throughout the galaxy, turning the institute into a cautionary tale about the dangers of academic arrogance. Time for desperate measures. I propose, the director continued, pausing for dramatic effect that fooled absolutely no one, that we expand our search parameters, more academic speak. This time for hire someone we would normally consider beneath. The committee members exchanged glances that would have been meaningful if any of them had been willing to admit what they were all thinking. They needed to call in a Deathworlder, specifically a human. The human arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed somehow appropriate for an event that would later be remembered as either the Institute's salvation or the final nail in its credibility coffin. She disembarked from a modest transport vessel that looked positively primitive next to the sleek diplomatic cruisers typically gracing the Institute's landing bay. No ceremonial escort, no fanfare, just a single individual carrying what appeared to be actual paper notebooks, an affectation so charmingly backward that several resonant scholars actually stopped their harmonic discussions to stare. The director had been explicit in their instructions to the staff: treat their new consultant with the same professional courtesy extended to any expert. What they had not specified was how to reconcile this directive with the barely concealed horror most Institute personnel felt when confronted with an actual Deathworlder. Humans, after all, came from a planet that actively tried to kill its inhabitants on a daily basis. Their homeworld boasted predators that hunted for sport, weather patterns that could level cities without warning, and geological instabilities that made other species question the sanity of anything that had evolved. The fact that humans had not only survived but thrived in such conditions was viewed by most galactic civilizations as either a statistical miracle or evidence of profound mental instability, possibly both. The human translator made her way through the Institute's corridors with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to navigating hostile environments. She seemed entirely unbothered by the way conversations died as she passed, or how various scholars found sudden reasons to examine their research materials, with intense fascination rather than make eye contact with the primitive newcomer. The resonants were particularly amusing in their discomfort. Their crystalline forms naturally resonated with emotional frequencies, which meant they literally could not hide their disdain. Their bodies chimed with discord whenever the human came within range, producing sounds like wind chimes in a hurricane. The effect was so pronounced that several younger scholars had to excuse themselves to avoid the embarrassment of their bodies broadcasting their prejudices in audible form. The drifters, lacking solid form, had developed their own method of expressing superiority. They would condense their gaseous bodies into smaller, denser configurations when forced to interact with lower species. Around the human, they looked like storm clouds trying to squeeze themselves into teacups. The effect was both ridiculous and oddly endearing, like watching cosmic entities have anxiety attacks. The calculans, true to their nature, had simply run statistical analyses on human intellectual capabilities, and concluded that the probability of success was approximately. They shared this assessment with anyone who would listen, apparently unaware that betting against impossibly low odds was precisely how most great discoveries happen. The head of xenolinguistics, whose name consisted of 17 harmonically aligned crystal resonances that roughly translated to enlightened speaker of ancient wisdom, had volunteered to conduct the initial briefing. This was partly professional duty, and partly morbid curiosity about what would happen when a Deathworld primitive encountered the Institute's greatest intellectual challenge. The briefing room itself was a testament to academic excess. Holographic displays showed the 17 different archaeological sites where the void script had been discovered, while floating data crystals contained centuries of failed analysis attempts. The walls were lined with translation matrices, linguistic probability charts, and enough theoretical frameworks to choke a small moon. The human took one look around the room and made a sound that might have been suppressed laughter. "Impressive," she said, and somehow managed to make the words sound like both a compliment and a gentle mockery. "You've certainly been thorough." The resonant scholar's form flickered with what was definitely annoyance. The void script represents one of the galaxy's greatest linguistic mysteries. Scholars have devoted entire careers to understanding even fragments of its meaning. How many careers exactly? Thousands. Perhaps tens of thousands, if you count graduate research projects. The human nodded thoughtfully. "And in all that time, how much of the script have you successfully translated?" The silence that followed was so complete it could have been bottled and sold as a meditation aid. The script has proved resistant to conventional analysis, the scholar finally admitted, their crystalline form dimming with what might have been embarrassment. Resistant. The human repeated the word with the same tone one might use to describe a particularly stubborn jar lid. May I see the original sample? What followed was a procession that would have impressed visiting dignitaries from lesser civilizations. Environmental suits were deployed to maintain the precise atmospheric conditions required for optimal script preservation. Gravitational stabilizers ensured that even microscopic vibrations could not damage the ancient carvings. Holographic projectors created perfect three-dimensional reproductions, while sonic barriers prevented any possible acoustic interference. The human waited patiently through this elaborate ritual, her expression carefully neutral. When the first script sample finally materialized in its protective display field, surrounded by enough technological safeguards to protect a galactic treasury, she leaned forward and studied it with the same casual attention one might give to a shopping list. Then she smiled. It was a soft smile, barely noticeable, but it sent ripples of unease through the assembled scholars. There was something in that expression that suggested the human was not looking at an impossible mystery, but at something almost familiar. Interesting, she murmured, and reached for one of her primitive paper notebooks. That smile should have been classified as a weapon of mass academic destruction. The human sat there, surrounded by nearly a millennium's worth of failed scholarly attempts, looking at the void script with the same expression a parent might wear while watching their child struggle with basic arithmetic. Her pen, an actual ink-dispensing writing instrument that belonged in a museum of primitive technology, moved across her notebook with quick, confident strokes. The assembled scholars watched this display with the fascination of anthropologists observing an undiscovered ritual. Surely the Deathworlder was simply documenting her initial impressions, before beginning the long, inevitable journey toward intellectual defeat. After all, if the galaxy's finest minds had failed for 8 centuries, what could one primitive human possibly accomplish in a few moments? The head of xenolinguistics cleared their crystalline throat, producing a sound like expensive glass being politely shattered. We should perhaps begin with the established theoretical framework. The harmonistic school suggests that the script represents— "Oh, this is adorable," the human interrupted, not looking up from her scribbling. "You've been treating this like it's some kind of mystical religious text, haven't you?" The silence that followed could have been used to preserve archaeological specimens. "The script clearly represents advanced philosophical concepts," declared the chief archaeological analyst, their gaseous form rippling with indignation. "The geometric precision, the systematic repetition of certain symbol clusters, the way it appears across multiple star systems, all evidence of profound metaphysical significance." The human's pen stopped moving. She looked up at the assembled academics, with an expression that managed to be simultaneously polite and devastating. "Have any of you ever tried to teach someone how to make fire?" More silence, this time with undertones of confusion. "Because," the human continued, turning back to the holographic display, "that's what this is. It's an instruction manual, a very basic, very practical instruction manual for surviving on a hostile planet." The senior computational linguists' processors whirred audibly as they attempted to parse this information. "Impossible. Our analysis indicates complex recursive patterns, suggesting higher-order meaning structure." "Your analysis," the human replied with devastating gentleness, "has been looking for profundity where there's just practicality. This symbol cluster you've identified as representing cosmic unity, it's describing how to purify water using solar distillation. These sacred geometric patterns are architectural diagrams for basic shelters." She stood up and approached the holographic display, pointing to specific sections with her primitive writing implement. "See this sequence you've spent 3 centuries analyzing? It's explaining how to identify edible plants versus poisonous ones. The mystical numerical progressions are actually describing seasonal growing cycles." The director's breathing apparatus wheezed with what might have been disbelief or impending system failure. "Preposterous. The script appears across 17 different star systems. Why would survival instructions be carved into permanent structures across multiple worlds?" The human's smile widened slightly, taking on an edge that suggested she was enjoying this far more than professional courtesy demanded. "Because whoever wrote this came from a death world, just like me. And the first thing you learn on a death world is that knowledge isn't theoretical, It's the difference between living and becoming something else's dinner. She gestured toward the display with casual authority that made several scholars unconsciously step backward. They weren't creating monuments to their wisdom. They were leaving emergency instructions. Think of them as the galactic equivalent of "in case of emergency, break glass" sign. The chief archaeological analyst's form had contracted so much they now resembled a meteorologically distressed fog bank. But the complexity of the language structure, the sophisticated grammatical frameworks, are exactly what you'd expect from a species that needed to communicate complex survival information clearly and unambiguously. The human finished. When your life depends on following directions exactly, you develop very precise ways of giving them. She turned back to her notebook, flipping through pages covered in what looked like straightforward translations. The reason you couldn't crack this isn't because it's too advanced. It's because it's too practical. You've been looking for spiritual enlightenment in a how-to guide for not dying. The head of xenolinguistics made a sound like crystal wind chimes falling downstairs. Even if we accept your interpretation, how could you possibly translate it so quickly when our greatest experts have failed for centuries? The human looked up from her notes with that same soft, devastating smile. Because I recognize every Deathworld species develops similar survival techniques. The specific methods vary, but the principles are universal. She gestured toward the script. Water purification, food preservation, shelter construction, predator avoidance, emergency signaling. It's all standard Deathworlder curriculum, but the symbolic complexity, began another scholar, is what happens when you need to be absolutely certain your instructions won't be misunderstood. The human interrupted. When close enough gets you eaten, you develop very detailed ways of saying "do this exactly" or "die horribly." She flipped to a fresh page in her notebook. Your problem isn't that this script is impossibly alien. Your problem is that it's written by and for people who live in places where making mistakes has fatal consequences. You've been analyzing it from the perspective of beings whose biggest daily concern is whether the temperature in their environmental suits is optimally calibrated. The assembled scholars exchanged glances that conveyed approximately 17 different flavors of academic panic. Centuries of research, thousands of careers, entire theoretical schools built around the assumption that they were dealing with profound cosmic wisdom, all potentially reduced to the equivalent of a wilderness survival handbook. The human continued translating with casual efficiency that was somehow more devastating than outright mockery. Each symbol cluster that had confounded the galaxy's greatest minds yielded its secrets with embarrassing ease. The cryptic repetitive sequences turned out to be safety warnings repeated for emphasis. The numerological mysteries were measurements and quantities. The philosophical frameworks were step-by-step procedures. There, she said finally, closing her note. I've got about 60% translated already. Give me another day and I'll have the whole thing finished. The silence that followed was so profound it achieved its own gravitational field. 60%, repeated the director, their translator crackling with static that might have been disbelief. In less than 2 hours. Well, the human replied with that increasingly familiar smile. It helps when you know what you're looking at. The next morning arrived with all the subtlety of a stellar collision, bringing with it the kind of academic chaos that would be studied in university crisis management courses for generations to come. Word of the human's preliminary translation had spread through the institute's corridors like a particularly virulent strain of intellectual panic. By dawn, the translation chamber had filled with every scholar, researcher, and academic administrator who could manufacture a reason to be there. They clustered around the displays like moths, drawn to a flame that was about to burn down everything they thought they knew about xenolinguistics. The human arrived precisely on schedule, carrying her anachronistic notebooks, and wearing the same expression of polite competence that had proven so devastatingly effective the day before. She seemed entirely unperturbed by the crowd of desperate academics, hanging on her every word, as if reducing centuries of scholarly work to rubble was just another item on her daily agenda. Good morning, she said, settling into her chair with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted the outcome of this particular intellectual demolition project. Shall we continue? The director's breathing apparatus was working overtime, producing sounds that suggested their respiratory system was engaged in philosophical combat with reality itself.
Before we proceed, they managed, perhaps you could explain your methodology in greater detail, for the benefit of our academic records. Translation, please tell us how you accomplished in hours what we couldn't do in centuries, so we can salvage some dignity from this catastrophe. The human opened her notebook to a page covered in neat handwriting that looks suspiciously like organized common sense. It's really quite straightforward once you understand the context. The species that created this script came from what you'd classify as a Class 12 Deathworld: extreme weather, aggressive fauna, unstable geology, atmospheric toxins, the works. She gestured toward the holographic displays showing the 17 archaeological sites. They weren't spreading their philosophy across the galaxy, they were establishing emergency supply caches and survival stations. Each site contains the same information, because each site needed to provide the same life-saving services to anyone who might stumble across them. The head of xenolinguistics made a sound like expensive crystal being systematically shattered by reality. But the complexity of the grammatical structures reflects the complexity of staying alive in hostile environments. The human interrupted with devastating gentleness. When you're explaining how to construct a water filtration system using local materials, precision isn't academic, it's literally a matter of life and death. One mistranslated symbol could mean the difference between clean drinking water and a particularly unpleasant way of dying. She flipped through several pages of her notebook, each one filled with translations that had the uncomfortable ring of practical truth. The reason your harmonic analysis failed is because this language wasn't designed for aesthetic beauty. It was designed for absolute clarity under extreme stress. Every symbol has exactly one meaning, with no room for artistic interpretation or philosophical nuance. The senior computational linguists' processors hummed with increasing desperation as they attempted to integrate this information into their existing framework. Our statistical models indicated sophisticated recursive patterns, suggesting your statistical models were looking for complexity where there's just thoroughness. The human said, not unkindly, yes, there are recursive patterns, but they're repetition for emphasis and safety redundancy. When you're teaching someone to identify which local plants will kill them, you repeat the important parts. She stood and approached the main display, pointing to sections of script with casual authority. This section here, which you've classified as advanced metaphysical concept, it's describing how to recognize and avoid predatory species based on tracks, scat and territorial markings. The sacred numerical sequences are body measurements for constructing protective gear using local material. The assembled scholars watched in horrified fascination as she methodically dismantled centuries of academic theory with the kind of practical knowledge that their civilizations had collectively forgotten existed. The most ironic part, she continued, warming to her subject with the enthusiasm of someone delivering particularly elegant devastation, is that you actually had most of the individual symbol meanings correct. Your dictionaries are quite comprehensive, but you were trying to make poetry out of instruction manuals. The chief archaeological analyst had condensed into what resembled a small, very distressed rain cloud. Even accepting your interpretation, how did you recognize the content so readily? The human smile took on that soft, dangerous quality that had become her signature expression. Because I've lived it, every human has to some degree. Our homeworld taught us that survival knowledge isn't theoretical, it's practical, immediate, and absolutely essential. When I looked at these symbols describing water purification techniques, I didn't see ancient wisdom. I saw Tuesday afternoon at Wilderness Training Camp. She returned to her notebook and began reading from her completed translation. What emerged was not the profound cosmic philosophy that had tantalized scholars for centuries, but something far more remarkable, a comprehensive guide to surviving the unsurvivable, written by a species that had faced extinction daily, and developed the practical wisdom to not just endure, but thrive. The manual covered everything from emergency shelter construction, using materials that could be found on virtually any terrestrial world, to food preservation techniques that didn't require advanced technology, to communication methods for coordinating group survival efforts. It was exhaustive, practical, and utterly devoid of the mystical significance that had attracted centuries of academic attention. The final section, the human said, reaching the end of her translation, is actually quite touching. It's essentially a message to anyone who might find these caches. We hope you never need this information. But if you do, may it help you live to see tomorrow. The silence that followed was the sound of academic careers crashing into reality like meteors hitting atmosphere. The director finally found their voice, though it emerged as more of a croak than coherent speech. How many other mysteries might be similarly misunderstood? The human's smile widened into something that managed to be both sympathetic and terrifying. Well, since you asked, there are at least 47 other untranslated scripts in your archives that show similar structural patterns to this one. I'd estimate that about 30 of them are probably instruction manuals for various practical applications. She closed her notebook with the satisfied gesture of someone who had just completed a particularly enjoyable demolition project. The good news is that once you understand you're looking at practical information rather than philosophical treatises, most of them should be much easier to translate. You might want to consider hiring more consultants with actual survival experience. The assembled academics stood in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of their collective oversight. Centuries of theories, thousands of research papers, entire academic careers built on the assumption that they were dealing with transcendent wisdom, all reduced to the galactic equivalent of user manual. The human gathered her primitive notebooks and stood to leave, pausing at the chamber entrance to deliver one final observation that would haunt the Institute's halls for generations to come. The thing about Deathworlders, she said with that soft, devastating smile, is that we know the difference between what sounds profound and what actually keeps you alive. Sometimes the most important knowledge is also the most practical. She walked away, leaving behind a room full of the galaxy's greatest minds, contemplating the uncomfortable possibility that their sophisticated intellects had been outsmarted by common sense. And somewhere in the Institute's archives, 47 other impossible mysteries waited patiently to reveal their practical secrets to anyone wise enough to ask the right question. The director looked around at their devastated colleagues and made a mental note to update their hiring policies immediately. After all, they had a lot more Deathworld wisdom to uncover.